War Machiner presents Drone Warfare, Misin Nap War Kembribap and Napor, Middle East Theater. When we talk about drone warfare in the Middle East, the mental image is almost always the same. A predator, miles high, silent and unseen, piloted by a man in a trailer in Nevada watching a grainy feed of a compound before releasing a Hellfire missile. This is the American paradigm of drone war. Surgical, expensive, and reliant on complete air supremacy. But if you only understand that model, you understand nothing about where warfare is actually going. There is another drone war that has been fought over the same terrain, and it looks nothing like the American version. This war is fought with plywood and prayer, with engines bought on Alibaba and warheads fabricated in mountain workshops. It is a war where the cost of the weapon is deliberately less than the cost of stopping it. While the world was watching the United States conduct its precision strikes, a parallel history was being written by militias and state actors who were building a different kind of air force, one designed not for a single perfect strike, but for attrition, psychological terror, and the exhaustion of empires. This is the history of the drone war that actually changed the rules, and it didn't start in the Nevada desert. It started with a militia in sandals and an Iranian reverse-engineered cruise missile bolted to a foam glider. The sound of a two-stroke engine became as significant as the roar of a jet fighter. To understand the current state of drone warfare, you have to look at a largely unnoticed incident in October 2017 in Yemen's Damar province. An obscure religious movement known as the Houthis, or Ansarallah, shot down a US MQ-9 Reaper drone. This in itself was notable. A $60 million aircraft brought down by a militia, but it wasn't the first, and it wouldn't be the last. They repeated the feat in 2019, and again in 2023. The narrative spun by defense analysts was always about the sophistication of Iranian missiles, but the deeper lesson was missed. These militias weren't just shooting things down, they were learning how to build their own air force from the wreckage. The Houthis, and their primary state backer Iran, understood something the United States did not. That the future of air power was not in stealth coatings, but in sheer mass. By the time Russia invaded Ukraine, the world finally saw what Iran had been perfecting in the Middle East for a decade, the Shahed 136. Here was a weapon that looked like a tiny, crude delta-wing glider with a lawnmower engine bolted to the back. It was slow, loud, and carried a warhead of only about 50 kilograms. By every metric of Western military evaluation, it was a piece of junk, but it cost between $20,000 and $50,000. And it could fly over 1,000 miles. The equation changed from can we hit the target, to can we afford to stop it. This is the paradigm shift that most military historians overlook when they study the Middle East theater. It's not really a story of technological marvel, it's a story of economic warfare. When the Houthis launched drones at Saudi oil facilities at Abqaiq and Khurais in 2019, they temporarily took half of Saudi oil production offline. The world called it a bold attack. The military planners called it a wake-up call, because honestly, the math was devastating. A Patriot missile interceptor cost somewhere in the neighborhood of $3 to $4 million. A Shahed drone cost $50,000 at most. The defense was literally 60 times more expensive than the offense. This is the reality that defines the modern Middle Eastern battlefield. Iran, watching from Tehran, internalized this math. They began producing these drones not as a niche weapon, but as a core component of their military doctrine. By 2026, during the escalation following strikes on Iranian leadership, Iran launched thousands of these drones at targets across the Gulf. The United States and its allies were forced to fire interceptor missiles that cost millions to stop drones that cost thousands. It was not a battle for air supremacy in the traditional sense, it was a battle for the sustainability of the treasury. While Iran was scaling up its so-called poor man's air force, a different, more granular evolution was actually taking place on the ground. The Islamic State, or Daesh, during the battle for Mosul in 2017, did something that seemed almost absurd at the time. They went to a hobby shop. They bought DJI Phantom drones, commercial quadcopters made in China, available to anyone with a credit card. At first they used them for surveillance, feeding intelligence back to fighters in the city. But then, someone had an idea that would honestly change infantry warfare forever. They They took a 3-pound mortar shell, rigged it with a simple release mechanism, and bolted it to the bottom of the drone. The first time a soldier looked up and saw a hobby drone dropping a grenade on his position, the psychological impact was, well, immense. These drones could travel up to 7 kilometers and carry payloads of up to 40 kilograms. In January 2017, Daesh formalized this capability, announcing a new unmanned aircraft of the Mujahideen unit. Their drones didn't have the operational effect of turning the tide of the battle, but they forced the coalition to divert immense resources to counter a threat that cost just $500. The US military began targeting individual drone operators with airstrikes, treating a hobbyist with a laptop as a high-value target. The lesson here was about the democratization of precision. The car bomb was the signature weapon of 20th century insurgencies. The hobby drone became the signature of the 21st. By 2024 and 2025, the drone war had matured beyond the battlefield and into the civilian sphere. The Houthis, blockaded by a Saudi-led coalition and facing constant bombing, looked at their geography. They controlled the coastline along the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, a choke point through which roughly 12% of global trade passes. Using a combination of anti-ship missiles and drones, they effectively shut down the Red Sea to shipping. A non-state actor, a group that the world had dismissed as a tribal militia, was holding the global economy hostage. They were attacking vessels not with a navy, but with drones launched from pickup trucks. This was not random violence. It was a calculated strategy of horizontal escalation. By targeting commercial shipping, they were able to impose costs on every nation that traded through the Suez Canal, without having to directly engage their navies. Insurance rates for ships traveling through the region increased tenfold. The United States assembled a coalition of over 20 nations to patrol the waters, a massive expenditure of naval resources to counter a threat that cost $50,000 per unit. The Houthis had effectively weaponized the global economy against itself. This brings us to the most ironic and overlooked development of the drone war in the Middle East, the adoption of the enemy's tactic by the superpower. In late 2025, US Central Command announced the formation of Task Force Scorpion Strike. Their weapon of choice was a drone called Lucas, low-cost, uncrewed combat attack system. The US military, after years of watching the Shahed 136 terrorize bases and oil fields, had reverse-engineered the Iranian design. They took the concept of a cheap, one-way attack drone, improved the guidance systems, and began fielding them in the Middle East. Think about the historical weight of that decision. The United States, the nation that pioneered the age of stealth and precision, was now building the same weapon that its adversaries had used to bleed its resources. It was an admission that the era of the multi-million-dollar missile as the primary strike weapon was ending. The future belonged to mass. Admiral Brad Cooper, head of U.S. forces in the Middle East, put it bluntly: they had taken the Iranian design, made them better, and fired them right back at Iran. When the history of this period is written, it will not be remembered for the tank battles, because there were none. It will be remembered as the time when the monopoly on air power was broken. For decades, the ability to project power from the sky belonged to the nations that could afford air forces. The Middle East theater from 2017 to 2026 proved that the barrier to entry had collapsed. A militia in Yemen, backed by Iran, could now threaten US warships. A terrorist group in Mosul could ground infantry advances. A state like Iran could force a coalition of Western powers to burn billions of dollars in defensive munitions. The survivalist-minded viewer should pay attention to this. The lesson is not about drones themselves. It is about the vulnerability of complex systems. The modern world runs on just-in-time logistics, expensive infrastructure, and the assumption of safety. The drone war in the Middle East proved that a cheap, expendable system, deployed en masse, can paralyze a sophisticated one. It doesn't take a stealth bomber to change the world anymore. It takes an engine, a warhead, and the will to use it. This is War Machiner. If you value in-depth historical analysis that looks beyond the headlines and into the hard lessons of conflict, take a moment to subscribe. Share this video with someone who needs to understand how the rules of war are actually changing. We don't do surface level here, we dig into the dirt.